Preston called again today?
Just tying up some paperwork on the house.
What kind of paperwork needs a lawyer who isn't ours?
Efficiencies, liability stuff. You wouldn't find it interesting.
Try me.
It's under control, Imara. That's all you need to know right now.
Right now. That's an interesting way to put it. That was the first night I understood he wasn't hiding something small. Actually, there was a night in late October I still think about. Kendrick had fallen asleep on the couch and... You know what? Let me take it from when the real drama happened.
The pen felt heavier than it should have. "Are you ready to sign?" the closing attorney asked, sliding the stack of papers an inch closer to me. I looked at the folder in my lap, instead of the documents in front of me. Kendrick's knee was bouncing under the table, the way it hadn't bounced since the week we found out his mother's biopsy came back clean. Cecilia, our realtor, kept smiling at both of us like a woman trying to hold a room together with nothing but teeth. The keys to the house on Belhaven Ridge sat on the table between us in a small velvet pouch, and 3 hours earlier they had meant everything I'd worked for. "Imara?" Kendrick said my name carefully, like he was testing whether it would still answer to him. I opened the folder. I didn't say a word. I let him watch me read. "I have a few questions before I sign anything," I said finally, and my voice came out steadier than I expected it to. "Actually, I think Kendrick has some answers he owes everyone at this table first." Nobody moved. The attorney's pen stopped clicking. And for the first time in 11 months, my husband looked like a man who understood he was no longer the only person in the room who knew the truth. 2 weeks before that morning, I still believed that house was going to save us. I should say this plainly. I loved my husband for good reasons, not foolish ones. Kendrick Ashworth was the kind of man who remembered how you took your coffee 3 years after you mentioned it once. He built a custom bookshelf for my mother's Bible collection the year she passed, without me asking. He called his own mother every Sunday at 4 o'clock like it was a job he refused to lose. For 22 years, that was the man I went to sleep next to. We met when I was 26, working nights at Sinai General as a charge nurse, and he was finishing his last year of an architecture apprenticeship, sketching floor plans on napkins at the diner where I ate my 3 a.m. breakfast. He used to say he fell for the woman who could read blueprints upside down before she even ordered her eggs. I used to say I fell for a man who never once made me feel like my ambition was a competition with his. We built a good life. Not an easy one. We lost a pregnancy in our 30s that neither of us has ever fully spoken about since, and there were 2 years in our 40s when his contracting business nearly folded and I picked up every overtime shift the hospital would give me. But we built something. By the time I turned 48, I had moved from bedside nursing into hospital administration, and Kendrick had his own small design build firm with his name on the door. We weren't wealthy. We were, for the first time in a long time, comfortable. And then my father died. He left me the house in Ridgemont Heights, the one I grew up in, along with a modest life insurance payout. After the sale of the house and the settlement of his small estate, I had just under $310,000 sitting in an account that felt less like money and more like the last physical trace of him. Kendrick had been talking about Belhaven Ridge for almost 2 years by then. It was a 5-bedroom colonial on a bluff overlooking the reservoir, the kind of house he used to point at during our Sunday drives and say, "One day." The owners were finally ready to sell, and the asking price was $840,000. More house than either of us had ever seriously discussed buying. "We could actually do this," he said the night I told him about the inheritance. We were sitting at our kitchen table, the one with the water ring neither of us had ever sanded out. "Your money as the down payment, my income and the sale of our current place covering the mortgage. Imara, this is the house I've been designing in my head since I was 25 years old. I want to be honest about something. Some part of me hesitated, not because I doubted him, because it was my father's money, and some private, unspoken part of me wanted to protect that. But Kendrick took my hand across that table and said something I still remember word for word. Your father built something for you your whole life. Let me build something for us with what he left behind. I want both our names on that deed. Imara, equal partners, same as we've always been. I believed him. I want you to understand that clearly, because everything that follows makes more sense once you know I wasn't naive. I simply trusted a man who had given me 22 years of reasons to. There was a version of that conversation I've replayed since, trying to find the exact second where the story could have gone differently. I remember asking him, half joking, half serious, whether he was sure he wanted to tie his name to a house that big, at 52, whether it wasn't easier to stay in Cypress Street, the house we'd raised our life in, paid off, familiar down to the creak in the third stair. He'd laughed and said something about how a man spends his whole career designing other people's dream homes and deserves, once, to live inside one of his own. I remember thinking that was fair. I remember thinking I wanted that for him too. For us. What I didn't examine closely enough, at the time, was how quickly the conversation moved from our future to a future built almost entirely around what he had always wanted, with my inheritance folded in as fuel rather than foundation. I don't say that to excuse what came later. I say it because I think it matters. For anyone listening who has handed someone they loved the keys to a decision this large, pay attention not just to what someone promises you, but to whose dream you're actually funding. We put $280,000 down. I kept $30,000 back, a habit my father drilled into me. Never empty an account completely, no matter how good the reason feels. Kendrick handled most of the paperwork himself. It was, after all, his professional world, not mine. He walked me through spreadsheets about mortgage terms and closing costs with the same patient tone he used when explaining structural load-bearing walls, and I signed where he told me to sign, trusting the same hands that had built bookshelves for my mother. If you've ever handed someone you loved the most important resource you had left from a parent who was gone, and told yourself it was an act of faith rather than a risk, stay with me through what's coming. And if this kind of story, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't announce itself with shouting, is the kind you come here for, consider subscribing to Milan Folktales, because what I found 4 months later wasn't the ending of this story. It was only the moment I stopped explaining away what I could already feel. The first crack came in October, small enough that I nearly convinced myself I'd imagined it. Kendrick had always kept his business email separate from his personal one, a habit from years of contract disputes and client paperwork. That had never bothered me. But one evening, working from his laptop because mine had died mid-report, I noticed his email client open in the background, and a subject line caught my eye before I could stop myself from reading it. R.E. Bellhaven Ridge, Title Structure Options. I told myself it was routine. Title structures were part of buying a house. I closed the laptop and didn't mention it. 2 weeks later, he mentioned, almost in passing, that his attorney, not our attorney, his attorney, a name I didn't recognize, someone named Preston Cade, had suggested some paperwork efficiencies for the closing. What kind of efficiencies? I asked. Just structuring it in a way that protects the house from liability, given the business, he said, not looking up from his phone. You know how contractors get sued. It's smart, that's all. Standard stuff. I didn't know how contractors get sued, not in detail, and I told myself that not knowing wasn't the same as being lied to. That's the thing about a 22-year marriage. You build a version of your spouse in your mind, so complete, so familiar, that you'd rather doubt your own instincts than doubt the architecture of a person you helped design. Then came the changed passwords. Our shared cloud drive, the one where we kept scanned copies of tax returns and insurance documents, suddenly required a password I no longer had. I updated our security, Kendrick said when I asked. Too many breaches in the news lately. I'll send you the new one. He never did. Not that week, not the next. Then came a phone call I overheard the tail end of. Kendrick standing on our back porch in November, with his voice low, in a way I hadn't heard since his firm nearly went under. "She doesn't need to see that version," he said, before he noticed me in the doorway and hung up fast enough that his thumb slipped and the phone clattered against the porch railing. "Client stuff," he said. "Contract dispute. Nothing you need to worry about." I told myself that too. I told myself a lot of things that autumn, the way you do when you've built a life around trusting someone, and the alternative feels like demolition. There was a night in late October I still think about. Kendrick had fallen asleep on the couch, with the Belhaven floor plans spread across his chest, one hand still resting on the page, like he didn't want to let it go, even unconscious. I stood in the doorway and watched him for a long time, and I felt, underneath the unease that had been building for weeks, a genuine tenderness. This was still the man who'd stayed up all night in a hospital waiting room with me, who'd learned to braid our niece's hair from a video so she wouldn't have to go to school looking, in his words, like nobody loved her that morning. I didn't want to become a woman who turned a good marriage into a courtroom over a bad feeling. That tenderness is part of why it took me as long as it did to let myself see what was actually in front of me. I think that's true for a lot of women in my position, and I don't think it's a weakness. I think it's what love is supposed to feel like, right up until someone uses it against you. Priscilla noticed before I said anything to her directly. We'd known each other since our first year of nursing school, the kind of friendship built on 12-hour shifts and shared vending machine dinners. And she had a way of reading me that even Kendrick had never quite managed. "You've got that look," she said one Sunday, over coffee at her kitchen table. "The one you had right before you told me the numbers weren't adding up on the business account back in '09. "I don't know what I'm looking at yet," I told her honestly. "I just know something's not sitting right." "Then don't rush it," she said. Rushing it is how people talk themselves out of what they already know. I held on to that advice more than she probably realized at the time. But somewhere underneath the explanations I kept accepting, a different kind of knowledge was quietly assembling itself. Not proof yet, just a shape, forming in the dark, waiting for enough light to be seen. By December, the closing date for Belhaven Ridge was set for the second week of February. Cecilia, our realtor, was thrilled. The sellers had agreed to a rent-back arrangement so we could take our time with the final walkthrough and inspection. Kendrick seemed happier than he had in months, spending his evenings sketching furniture layouts for rooms we hadn't even closed on yet. I wanted so badly to feel what he was feeling. Instead, I felt like a woman standing at the edge of a room, watching a party through a window she couldn't quite open. It was a Tuesday in December when Priscilla, my closest friend since nursing school, said something over lunch that I couldn't shake loose afterward. "You know Solange Reeves did the staging consultation for that house on Belhaven, right?" she said, stirring her tea. "My cousin does real estate marketing. She mentioned it. Small world." "I didn't know a Solange Reeves." I said so. "Designer. Does a lot of high-end staging and consulting for custom builds," Priscilla said. "Kendrick didn't mention her?" I figured, with his firm. "No," I said, "he didn't mention her." I don't know how to describe the particular chill of hearing a stranger's name for the first time from someone who isn't your husband, attached casually to the house you thought was the last big investment of your life together. That night, I didn't confront him. I did something quieter. I searched her name. Solange Reeves had a modest, professional website, interior design portfolio, warm lighting, tasteful photography, and in her client gallery, filed under custom builds, confidential client, was a photograph of a kitchen I recognized immediately because I had stood in it 3 weeks earlier during our second walkthrough of Belhaven Ridge. The photo was dated in September, before we'd even made our final offer. I didn't sleep that night. I lay next to Kendrick and listened to him breathe, steady and unbothered, while I turned the photograph over in my mind like a stone I couldn't stop pressing against. September. We hadn't submitted our offer until the first week of October, which meant that before I had signed a single document, before my father's money had even left its account, Kendrick had already brought a designer through that house, a house that, at the time, still belonged to someone else. I didn't say anything the next morning. I made his coffee the way I always did, black with 1 sugar, and I watched him kiss my forehead on his way out the door, and I understood, with a clarity that frightened me more than any confrontation could have, that I was no longer going to ask him directly. Direct questions had gotten me careful non-answers for 3 months. I needed something he wasn't prepared for, so I started paying attention the way I used to pay attention on the hospital floor during a shift where something was wrong with a patient, but the chart hadn't caught up to it yet. Small details, timing, patterns. I found out that Kendrick's Thursday site visits had increased from 1 a week to 3. I found out that his firm's calendar, which I had access to for scheduling reasons, had a recurring afternoon block marked only with the letter S. I found out, from a receipt I wasn't looking for, tucked into the pocket of a jacket I was taking to the dry cleaner, that he had purchased 2 coffees at a cafe in Fairview Commons on a day he told me he was at a job site 40 minutes in the opposite direction. None of it, on its own, was proof of an affair. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters. For most of December, I told myself I might be building a case against an innocent man out of grief and inherited money and a bad feeling. I have seen what suspicion does to good marriages when it's wrong. I didn't want to become a woman who destroyed something real because she couldn't tolerate uncertainty. But then, the week before Christmas, I saw them together. I hadn't followed him. I want to be clear about that too. I was picking up a prescription at the pharmacy in Fairview Commons, nothing more, when I saw Kendrick's truck parked outside the cafe Priscilla's cousin had mentioned, the one from the receipt. Through the window, I saw my husband sitting across from a woman I recognized instantly from her staging photos online, Solange Reeves. She was laughing at something he'd said, and he had that particular posture I recognized from 22 years of marriage, the one he used to have with me, early on, before comfort settled into us. Leaning forward, fully present, a man giving someone his whole attention. I didn't go in. I sat in my car in that parking lot for 11 minutes, watching my husband be a different man with a woman who wasn't me, and I made a decision that surprised me even as I made it. I wasn't going to confront him yet. I was going to find out everything first. I want to say something about Solange Reeves here, because it would be easy to make her the villain of this story, and I've come to believe that would be both inaccurate and unfair. In the weeks that followed, piecing together what I could from public records and the careless trail Kendrick left behind, I learned that Solange had met him nearly a year earlier, on an unrelated design consultation for one of his commercial clients. She was 43, recently out of a long relationship of her own, building a design practice from the ground up. From what I could later determine, Kendrick had told her, early and often, that his marriage had been effectively over for years, that we lived like roommates, that I had checked out long before she came into the picture, that he was staying in the marriage only until the right moment to leave without destabilizing his business. None of that was true. But I don't believe Solange had any real way of knowing that. She saw a man who spoke about his wife in the past tense, who invited her into the planning of a house he described as his fresh start, who told her, apparently, that the ownership structure was designed specifically so that nothing would be complicated when he finally left. She wasn't scheming to take something from me. She believed, as far as I can tell, that there was nothing left to take. That doesn't undo what happened, but it changed something in me, understanding it. My anger, when it finally arrived in full, aimed itself almost entirely at Kendrick, because he was the only one of the two of us who had actually known the truth the whole time. If you've ever sat somewhere quiet, holding proof of the thing you already knew in your body long before your mind caught up to it, I want you to know there's nothing weak about waiting before you act. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is refuse to let their pain make the next decision for them. That's where I was standing at the end of December. And if watching a woman choose clarity over chaos is a story worth staying for, this is the part of Milan Folktales where I'd ask you to stay through what comes next, because the affair, as painful as it was, turned out to be the smallest part of what I was about to learn. I didn't tell Priscilla what I'd seen, not yet. I didn't tell my sister. I did something else instead. Something Kendrick himself had unknowingly taught me to do. Over 2 decades of watching him handle contracts and disputes with a calm, methodical patience that used to make me proud of him. I started reading everything. Every document related to Belhaven Ridge that I could access. And because Kendrick had grown careless, because a man convinced his wife will never look too closely tends to stop covering his tracks as carefully, I found the operating agreement in a folder on the shared printer's memory, left there after he'd printed it and forgotten to clear the queue. It was for something called Belhaven Holdings LLC. I am not a lawyer. I want to say that plainly, because I don't want to pretend I understood every clause on first reading, but I understood enough. The LLC had been formed in September, the same month as that staging photograph, and it listed Kendrick as the sole managing member, not Kendrick and Imara Ashworth. Kendrick Ashworth, individually. The plan, as far as I could reconstruct it, was this. My down payment, my father's money, would be structured not as an equity contribution to a jointly owned property, but as a member loan to the LLC, repayable to me from Kendrick alone, personally, on terms he controlled, while the house itself, and any equity it built, belonged entirely to the LLC he solely managed. On paper, I would have loaned my husband $280,000. I would not own so much as a single percentage point of the house it purchased. I sat at our kitchen table with that document until the light outside went from gray to black, and I understood, finally, what protects the house from liability had actually meant. It had never been about protecting the house from his contracting business. It had been about protecting the house from me. I read the document 3 more times that week, in stolen minutes at work, in the parking garage before my shift started, in the bathroom with the door locked while Kendrick assumed I was running a bath. Each time, I noticed something new. A clause specifying that member loans from non-managing parties could be repaid on a schedule solely determined by the managing member, with no fixed timeline attached. A provision that any improvements made to the property using loaned funds would be considered capital improvements owned by the LLC, not the lender. It was, I came to understand, a document written by someone who had thought carefully about every question I might eventually ask, and had built an answer designed to sound reasonable to a woman who trusted her husband too much to read the fine print herself. I thought about all the nights I'd watched him hunched over his laptop in his office, the door mostly closed, and how I'd assumed he was buried in client contracts. I wondered how much of that time had actually been spent building the walls of a house I would help pay for and never legally stand inside. I still didn't confront him. 2 more weeks passed, the longest 2 weeks of my adult life, spent smiling at Christmas dinner with his mother, spent wrapping gifts, spent lying beside a man I now understood as a stranger, wearing 22 years of my husband's face. The closing was rescheduled for the 2nd week of February, pushed back slightly for a final inspection contingency. On the Thursday before, I came home early from a hospital board meeting that had ended sooner than expected, let myself in through the side door as I always did, and heard Kendrick's voice from his office down the hall. The door was open a few inches. He was on the phone. "No, she still thinks it's joint ownership. That's the whole point, Preston. As long as the paperwork clears before she's really looking at anything past the summary page." A pause. I know it's tight, but once we close, the LLC owns it outright, and what she signs at closing is just an acknowledgement form, not a deed. She won't even realize what she's not on. My hand found the door frame before I told it to. "And Solange," he continued, quieter now, "she's already talked to a moving company for March. I told her March 15th, once everything's settled and I've had the conversation with Imara. I'm not doing this messy. I want the house finished, the paperwork clean, and then I'll handle Imara the right way. She'll get the Cypress Street house free and clear in the divorce. That's more than fair. She'll be taken care of. I just need Belhaven to close first, exactly the way it's structured." I don't remember deciding to stay in that hallway rather than walk away. I remember the wall against my shoulder, cool through my blazer, and the particular sensation of hearing your entire future get discussed in the past tense by the person who was supposed to be building it with you. She helped me get everything I wanted, Kendrick said, and there was something almost fond in his voice, which was somehow worse than cruelty would have been. I'm not a monster, Preston. I just need her to sign before she starts asking the kind of questions that slow everything down. I walked back out the side door without him knowing I'd been there at all. I sat in my car in our own driveway for 40 minutes, the way I had sat in that parking lot in Fairview Commons weeks earlier. Except this time I wasn't deciding whether to confront a suspicion. This time, I already knew everything. What was left was deciding what to do with it. I didn't call a divorce attorney that night. I called my own money instead. Or rather, I called the person who understood it best. My cousin Julian had spent 11 years as a real estate and family law attorney downtown, and he was the only person outside that hallway who I trusted enough to bring the operating agreement to before I said a word to Kendrick. Julian read it twice, in silence, at his kitchen table, while I sat across from him, not touching the tea he'd made me. "This is legal," he said finally, which was not what I wanted to hear. Structuring a down payment as a member loan instead of an equity contribution. It's aggressive. And frankly, it's the kind of thing that should never happen between spouses without independent counsel on both sides. But on paper, if you sign the loan documents, it's enforceable. He'd owe you the money back, personally, with whatever interest terms are listed here. But the house, and everything it appreciates into, would be his. Or his LLC's, which for these purposes is the same thing. So he wasn't lying about paying me back, I said. No, Julian said carefully. He wasn't lying about that part. He was lying about what you'd own. There's a difference between owing someone money and owing someone a home. I asked him the only question that mattered. What do I sign and what do I not sign at that closing table? Julian looked at me for a long moment. What do you want to happen, Imara? Because there's a difference between protecting your money and confronting your marriage. You can do the first thing quietly. The second thing, you have to decide you're ready for. I thought about Kendrick's voice through that office door. I'm not doing this messy. As if the mess was the thing to be managed, not the 2 decades of marriage he'd already emotionally packed into boxes in his mind, months before he told me a single word of it. I'm ready for both, I said. Julian and I spent the 10 days before closing building something quiet and precise. He drafted an addendum, one that would require joint ownership language on the deed itself before I would sign anything. Not the acknowledgement form Kendrick had described to Preston Cade, but an actual amendment to the LLC's operating agreement, adding me as an equal managing member, effective before closing, or I would decline to fund the loan at all. Julian also pulled the full closing package from the title company under my name, as one of the parties to the transaction, a right I had and Kendrick apparently hadn't anticipated I'd use. I found things in that package Kendrick hadn't shown me. A mortgage pre-approval solely in his name, dated November, structured around income projections that assumed my loan would be fully dispersed and non-refundable at closing. A separate, quieter real estate search history, pulled from records Julian had access to through the title company, showing that Solange Reeves had viewed a 3-bedroom rental in Fairview Commons in January, listed as temporary housing, pending permanent move. I put all of it in a folder. I didn't confront Kendrick once during those 10 days. I made his coffee black with 1 sugar every morning. I let him believe the closing was proceeding exactly as he'd planned it. I understood, by then, that the folder wasn't really for him. It was for me, a physical record of the moment I stopped being a woman waiting to be told the truth, and became a woman who had gone and found it herself. Which brings us back to the closing table, February, the 2nd Tuesday of the month, the velvet pouch of keys sitting between us like an object that hadn't yet decided what it meant. I have a few questions before I sign anything, I had said. Actually, I think Kendrick has some answers. He owes everyone at this table first. Cecilia's smile had finally faltered. The attorney's pen stopped. Kendrick's knee stopped bouncing entirely, gone perfectly still, in the particular stillness of a man realizing the ground under him has already shifted. "Imara, what is this?" he said, low, like he could keep it contained to just the two of us, if he said it quietly enough. I opened the folder and set 3 documents on the table, one at a time. "This is the original operating agreement for Bellhaven Holdings LLC, listing you as sole managing member," I said. "This is the mortgage pre-approval you obtained in November, in your name only, calculated using my full down payment as a non-refundable contribution. And this is a rental application from January for a 3-bedroom unit in Fairview Commons, under Solange Reeves' name, listed as temporary housing, pending a permanent move." I paused. "I believe you told Preston Cade that move was scheduled for March 15th. The silence that followed was the kind I imagine surgeons know, the particular quiet of a room realizing a diagnosis has just been confirmed. "You went through my email," Kendrick said, and even then, even in that moment, his instinct was to make my knowledge the transgression instead of his plan. "No," I said. "I overheard you tell your attorney I still thought this was joint ownership. I overheard you say you didn't want me asking questions that would slow things down. So I stopped waiting to be told the truth, Kendrick, and I went and found it. Same as you'd have wanted anyone in your position to do." Cecilia had gone very still, professionally neutral in the way realtors learn to be when a closing stops being about a house and starts being about a marriage. The attorney, to her credit, said nothing at all, watching us both with the careful patience of someone who had clearly seen closings go sideways before, though perhaps never quite like this. "It was never going to be like that," Kendrick said finally, quieter now. "Imara, I was going to make sure you were taken care of. Cypress Street, free and clear, no mortgage, that's yours, regardless of anything else. I never wanted you to end up with nothing." "You wanted me to end up with a house you no longer wanted," I said, "while you moved into the one I paid for, with a woman you'd been planning a future with since before I signed a single document. And you wanted my own money to finance it, structured so carefully that I wouldn't even know what I didn't own until it was too late to stop it. That's not taking care of me, Kendrick. That's using 22 years of trust as a line of credit." He didn't answer that. I don't think he had an answer that wouldn't have confirmed exactly what I'd just said. "I'm not signing this closing," I said, and I slid the loan documents back across the table, untouched. "Not as structured. If you want to close on this house, it closes with both our names on the deed as equal owners, effective today, or it doesn't close with my money in it at all. Those are the only 2 options I came here with." Kendrick looked at the documents. He looked at Cecilia, then at the attorney, as though one of them might offer him a third option I hadn't already closed off. Neither of them did. "Take the amendment or don't," I said. "But either way, I'm walking out of this room today knowing exactly what I own and what I don't." That's the only closing I actually came here for. For a moment, nobody in that room moved. Cecilia's pen hovered over her own copy of the paperwork, uncertain, for the first time in what I imagine was a long career, of what her job actually required of her in that instant. The attorney finally spoke, carefully neutral, asking Kendrick directly whether he intended to proceed with the amended terms or withdraw from the transaction entirely. Kendrick looked at me for a long moment. I want to say I saw regret in his face, something close to the man I'd married surfacing underneath the one who'd built that operating agreement. Maybe I did. I've decided it doesn't matter either way. "I can't do the amendment," he said finally, quiet, almost to himself. "Preston structured the financing around the LLC holding it solely. If I add you as an equal member now, the loan terms with the bank." He stopped himself, as if hearing for the first time how much of his explanation was about protecting a structure and none of it was about protecting me. "Then we're done here," I said, and I stood up, and I did not look back at the velvet pouch of keys sitting on the table between us. I remember the drive home more clearly than almost anything else from that week. How ordinary the roads looked, how the radio was playing something I didn't recognize, how my hands were completely steady on the wheel in a way they hadn't been in months. I had expected, somehow, to feel shattered in that moment. Instead, I felt something closer to arriving somewhere after a very long drive, tired, clear-headed, finally parked. He didn't sign the amendment. I want to tell you he did, that some late instinct toward decency won out in that room, but that isn't what happened. Kendrick left the closing table without the house, without my $280,000, and, 3 weeks later, once the shock had worn into something closer to fury, without me. We filed for divorce in April. It took longer than either of us wanted, the way these things do when there's a house, however briefly ours, and a business, and 22 years of shared finances to untangle. Julian represented me. I learned over those months more about community property law than I ever wanted to know, and I learned something else too, something I hadn't expected, that Kendrick's plan had been so carefully built around my continued trust that once that trust was gone, so was most of his leverage. The court, in the end, treated my down payment as exactly what it had been in practice, regardless of what the LLC paperwork claimed. A marital contribution toward a jointly intended purchase, never completed, and therefore returned to me in full as part of the settlement, along with half the equity we'd built in our actual home on Cypress Street over 2 decades. The business side of the divorce took the longest to untangle. Kendrick's firm had grown, over the years, partly on the strength of contracts I'd helped him land, introductions through the hospital board, a redesign of a clinic wing that had put his name in front of half the developers in the city. Julian argued, successfully in the end, that a portion of the firm's increased value during our marriage counted as marital property regardless of whose name was on the license. Kendrick fought that harder than he fought almost anything else in the proceedings, which told me something about which parts of his life he considered truly his and which parts he'd been willing to let me help build, only for as long as it suited him. I don't know what happened to Bellhaven Ridge. Cecilia told me, months later, over a chance meeting at a mutual friend's retirement dinner, that it sold to another family that spring. I felt nothing when she told me. I think that surprised her more than it surprised me. I heard, secondhand, that Solange Reeves ended things with Kendrick not long after the closing collapsed, whether because the plan she'd believed in fell apart, or because she'd learned more about what kind of man builds his future on someone else's foundation. I never asked and was never told. I don't carry anger toward her the way I once thought I would. She was, I came to understand, another person who trusted a version of Kendrick that turned out not to be entirely true. Kendrick and I saw each other twice more after the closing collapsed, both times across a mediation table with our respective attorneys present. He tried, at the first session, to explain himself again. A longer version of the same reasoning, wrapped now in language about how the marriage had already been emotionally over for him for over a year. How he'd told himself the financial arrangement was simply catching the paperwork up to a truth he hadn't found the courage to say out loud. I let him finish. I didn't argue with any of it. There didn't seem to be much point in convincing a man to feel guiltier than he already did, or in performing forgiveness I hadn't actually arrived at yet. What I did tell him, once, was this. If you'd told me the marriage was over, Kendrick, I would have been devastated, and I would have survived it, the way people survive that kind of thing. What I can't get past is that you let me help build the life you were planning to live without me, and you were going to let me find out after I'd already paid for it. He didn't have an answer for that. I've come to believe there wasn't one. People ask me, sometimes, whether I regret giving him that money in the first place. I don't, not really. My father spent his whole life building something to leave behind, and in the end, that inheritance did exactly what inheritances are supposed to do. It protected me, eventually, even if not in the way any of us expected it to. Priscilla asked me once, over coffee at that same kitchen table where she'd told me not to rush what I already knew, whether I thought I'd ever trust anyone the way I trusted Kendrick. I told her I hoped not because I'd stopped believing in trust, but because I never wanted to hand someone that much of myself again without also keeping enough of my own foundation that I could survive losing it. She said that sounded less like giving up on love and more like finally learning how to stand inside it without disappearing. I think she was right, though it took me longer than I'd like to admit to believe her. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles into a person after a betrayal like that one. Not the loud grief people expect, the kind you're allowed to cry about in front of others, but a slower, more private reckoning with how much of yourself you'd folded into someone else's plans without noticing you were doing it. I spent most of that first year learning to notice it, learning to ask, before agreeing to anything significant, whose future I was actually building. I kept the keys, the small brass ones from Belhaven Ridge, for almost a year after everything settled, sitting in a drawer I rarely opened. I'm not sure why, maybe because they'd meant so many different things by the end, hope, then suspicion, then betrayal, that I needed time to let them mean something quieter before I could finally throw them away. I did, eventually. Last spring, on a Tuesday that meant nothing in particular, I dropped them into a donation bin outside the hardware store and didn't look back at them once. I bought a smaller house that fall, on my own, with my own name on every single document. It doesn't overlook a reservoir. It has a kitchen half the size of the one Solange Reeves once staged for a life I was never actually going to live. But every wall in it is mine, in the plainest, most legally uncomplicated sense of that word, and some nights, standing in that kitchen with a cup of tea, I think that's the first time in 22 years I've been able to say that about anything. I still work at Sinai General, though I've moved further into administration than I ever expected to when I was that 26-year-old charge nurse reading blueprints upside down over eggs at 3 in the morning. Kendrick's firm, I'm told, survived the divorce, smaller than it was, though I don't follow it closely enough to know much beyond that. I don't wish him harm. I've found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I don't wish him much of anything at all anymore. That absence of feeling, more than any dramatic ending I might once have imagined for this story, is what finally convinced me I was actually healing. I didn't lose a house that February morning. I lost the version of my marriage I'd spent 2 decades believing was real. What I found instead, underneath all of it, was something I hadn't gone looking for and didn't expect to keep: the plain, unglamorous relief of finally knowing exactly what was mine.